My psychopath brother used his girlfriend's dad passing as part of his stand-up comedy set, and when she got mad at him for it, he tampered with her car and tried to unalive her. She ended up in a coma, but after waking up contacted me, and we started working on ruining his life. He found out and went insane, forcing us to take drastic measures to keep us both safe. My brother was an aspiring stand-up comedian, and during his last routine, he made a joke so gut-wrenching, it landed him in the newspaper. A few months prior to this, his girlfriend's dad had recently taken his life, and he left a final note behind for her and only her to read. Well, my brother snooped through her things until he found the note, and when he did, he decided to use the note for his next set. Not only that, he made an entire skit about people taking their own lives, even going as far as directly quoting his girlfriend's dad's note. His girlfriend Sasha and I were in the audience when it happened, and I remember her jaw dropped. Next thing I knew, Sasha was on the stage, ripping the microphone from his hands, breaking up with him in front of everyone, and informing the audience about the joke he just made. What's worse is my brother had the audacity to act like she had given him permission to joke about it, even going as far as saying Steve would have appreciated this into the mic in an attempt to get the audience to laugh. She stormed off stage right after that, and by this point, the damage was done. My brother's stand-up career was ruined. In the following few days, he went on a rampage. No matter how much I tried talking him out of it, he was convinced that he was the victim, and would often pace around our house talking about making her pay for this. I called her just to warn her, telling her to please stay safe, but Sasha just gave a dismissive, sure. Well, not even a few days later my brother got out of bed looking happier than usual. He had this sinister smile, and when I asked him why he was so chirpy, he told me it's because he's now no longer the only one with a broken heart. I didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it gave me chills, so I snuck off to the bathroom. I texted Sasha to please call me, and that's when a few hours later, I got the call that's now forever seared into my brain. It was Sasha's sister. She was bawling her eyes out. Her cry was primal, guttural. She told me that my brother had snuck over to their house in the middle of the night and tampered with the clutch and brake pedals in Sasha's car. Nobody noticed him, and whilst going down the hill right outside her estate the next morning, Sasha couldn't stop her car. She rammed head-on into an oncoming vehicle, which had an elderly woman driving it. Sasha ended up in the hospital with a fractured rib, a broken nose, and a heart attack. Apparently, the heart attack happened because when she realized she couldn't stop the car, she became so scared that her heart rate spiked rapidly, and due to her pre-existing heart condition, she suffered a stroke. The elderly lady ended up in a coma. I felt like throwing up, and just then, right as I angrily whispered into the phone about how I would personally make sure my brother pays for this, I heard him behind me. The rest of the full story is on my channel and linked below. The look on his face, I can't even describe it properly. It wasn't guilt or shock or concern. It was this weird satisfaction, like he was pleased with himself for causing chaos. I promised Emma I'd make sure Glenn paid if he was responsible. When I hung up and faced my brother, the look in his eyes told me everything. There wasn't a hint of surprise or concern about Sasha being injured. Instead, he had this small smirk that made my stomach turn. My brother wasn't just troubled, he was dangerous. I whirled around to confront Glenn about what he'd done to Sasha's car, but he just smiled that unnervingly calm smile. Therefore, I lost control and shoved him against the bathroom wall. I'm not usually a violent person, but something in me snapped, seeing how pleased he looked about Sasha being hurt. Glenn laughed as his head hit the tile, but when I raised my fist, something in his eyes changed. Therefore, I hesitated, remembering the little brother who used to follow me everywhere. It was like for a split second, I saw the kid he used to be before all this darkness took over. "You could have killed her," I hissed, still pinning him, but Glenn replied, "That wasn't the plan, just wanted to give her a scare." Therefore, I realized he had calculated exactly how much damage he wanted to cause. The casual way he admitted it made my blood run cold, like he was talking about a minor prank instead of potentially deadly sabotage. I released him and demanded he turn himself in, but Glenn straightened his shirt casually, saying, "No one can prove anything." Therefore, I felt sick, knowing he had likely covered his tracks. He'd always been meticulous about getting away with things, even as a kid. I remember him once framing our cousin for breaking a window, planning it so carefully that everyone believed his story without question. My phone rang, Sasha's sister again with an update, but the news that Sasha was stabilizing made Glenn's smile falter. Therefore, I understood he wasn't finished with his revenge. He seemed almost disappointed that she wasn't hurt worse, which scared me more than anything else I'd seen from him. I told Glenn I was calling the police, but he grabbed my phone and reminded me that without evidence, I'd just be destroying our family. Therefore, I felt trapped between loyalty and doing what's right. He knew exactly which buttons to push. Our parents had always emphasized family loyalty above all else, and Glenn knew I wouldn't want to hurt them unless I was absolutely certain. Mom called asking why we weren't at Sunday dinner, but neither of us could explain the tension between us. Therefore, we agreed to a temporary truce to keep up appearances. Sunday dinners were sacred to our mom, and missing one without a good excuse would have meant endless questioning. At dinner, I watched Glenn charm our parents with stories about his new comedy direction, but I couldn't stomach his act. Therefore, I excused myself early, claiming a headache. He didn't mention the club incident or being blacklisted, instead spinning some tale about artistic differences with venue owners, and how he was exploring edgier material. Mom and Dad ate it up, of course. They always believed whatever narrative Glenn presented them with. Later that night, I drove to the hospital to check on Sasha, but security wouldn't let me in as I wasn't family. Therefore, I had to wait in the parking lot hoping to catch her sister. I felt so useless sitting there, knowing Glenn was responsible, but having no proof anyone would believe. The whole time, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see Glenn following me. Sasha's sister Emma finally appeared looking exhausted, but when she saw me, her expression hardened. Therefore, I realized she might blame me by association. She had dark circles under her eyes and was clutching a coffee like it was keeping her upright. Emma agreed to talk for 5 minutes, but she was suspicious of my intentions. Therefore, I had to show her text messages warning Sasha to prove I wasn't involved. I scrolled through my phone to show her the text I'd sent Sasha after Glenn's comedy show incident, warning her that he seemed unstable. Emma revealed the elderly victim, Mrs. Keaton, had awakened from her coma, but the woman was already talking about pressing charges against Sasha for reckless driving. Therefore, the situation was becoming more complicated than anyone anticipated. Mrs. Keaton was 76 years old and had been on her way to her weekly bridge game when the accident happened. Now she had a broken hip and would need months of physical therapy. I explained my suspicions about Glenn, but without concrete evidence, Emma was skeptical. Therefore, I promised to find proof of what Glenn had done. The whole conversation had this underlying tension. She wanted to believe me, but was understandably protective of her sister. Returning home, I found Glenn researching Sasha's recovery online, but he quickly closed his laptop when I entered. Therefore, I pretended not to notice while planning how to access his search history. I made some comment about ordering takeout to act normal, though my appetite was completely gone. I casually mentioned Mrs. Keaton had woken up, but Glenn's face paled slightly before regaining composure. Therefore, I knew this unexpected development was disrupting whatever plan he had in mind. He started asking questions about potential legal consequences for accidents like this, trying to sound casual, but clearly fishing for information. The next morning, I waited until Glenn left for his shift at the convenience store, but I discovered he'd taken his laptop with him. Therefore, I had to search his room for other evidence. This felt extreme, but I was genuinely worried he might hurt someone else. Under Glenn's bed, I found a shoebox containing tools with trace amounts of brake fluid, but as I was photographing them with my phone, I heard his car pull into the driveway. Therefore, I quickly replaced everything and slipped out of his room. I barely made it out before he came upstairs, claiming he'd forgotten his phone. Glenn seemed agitated when he returned, saying his boss had cut his hours, but I noticed grease under his fingernails that wasn't there when he left. Therefore, I suspected he'd been tampering with something else. The convenience store gig was just a part-time thing he'd picked up between comedy shows, so the cut hours story seemed like a convenient excuse for whatever he'd actually been doing. I casually mentioned visiting the garage where I parked my car, but Glenn immediately offered to drive me there. Therefore, I realized he might be worried about what I might find. His sudden helpfulness was completely out of character, making it even more suspicious. At the garage, I pretended to check my oil while looking for cameras, but the only security camera was pointing at the entrance, not the parking spaces. Therefore, I understood how Glenn could have worked on Sasha's car undetected. The garage was dimly lit and had these weird blind spots where you could work on a vehicle without being seen from the main driving lanes. I received a text from Emma saying Sasha was being released tomorrow, but when I checked my phone, Glenn was watching me intently. Therefore, I had to lie about who had texted me. I could feel his eyes on me, analyzing my reaction to the message. Glenn suggested we get lunch at the diner across from Sasha's apartment building, but his casual tone couldn't hide his true intentions. Therefore, I agreed to keep him in my sight. I figured if he was with me, at least he wasn't out there doing something worse. At the diner, Glenn kept watching Sasha's building between bites of his burger, but the waitress recognized him from the newspaper story. Therefore, we had to leave when she started whispering to coworkers. Glenn's face went red with anger when he realized people were talking about him, but he maintained his composure until we got to the car, then slammed his fist against the steering wheel repeatedly. Glenn insisted on driving past the hospital on our way home, but I noticed a small package in the back seat, partly covered by a jacket. Therefore, I distracted him to take a quick photo of it. I pointed out a car I pretended to recognize, just to get him to look away from me for a second. Back home, I enlarged the photo to see what looked like a burner phone and flowers, but this innocent-looking combination felt sinister, given Glenn's obsession. Therefore, I decided to follow him that night. The flowers weren't a typical bouquet, they were lilies, which I remembered Sasha saying reminded her of funerals after her dad's service. I pretended to go to bed early, but Glenn waited until 11 p.m. to sneak out. Therefore, I had to quickly grab my keys and follow his car at a distance. I almost lost him at a few traffic lights, but managed to stay far enough back that he wouldn't notice me. Glenn drove to the hospital parking lot and waited in his car, but security was doing rounds every 15 minutes. Therefore, he couldn't approach the building without being seen. He sat there for almost an hour, occasionally checking his phone and glancing at the hospital entrance. After an hour, Glenn left the hospital and drove to Sasha's apartment, but as he approached with the flowers, a police car turned onto the street. Therefore, he quickly retreated to his car. The timing was pure luck. The police weren't there for any particular reason, just a regular patrol, but Glenn panicked and practically ran back to his car. I followed Glenn back home, staying well behind, but as I parked down the street, my headlights briefly illuminated his rearview mirror. Therefore, he caught a glimpse of my car, a rookie mistake that I immediately regretted. I tried to sneak in through the back door, but Glenn was waiting in the dark kitchen. Therefore, the confrontation I'd been avoiding was now unavoidable. I nearly had a heart attack when he suddenly turned on the light as I was trying to quietly close the door. "Following me now?" Glenn asked with eerie calmness, but I refused to be intimidated. Therefore, I countered by asking why he was stalking Sasha with suspicious packages. He tried to seem nonchalant, but I could see the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Glenn claimed the flowers were an apology gesture, but I mentioned the burner phone I'd spotted. Therefore, he admitted he wanted to contact Sasha anonymously. His justification was that he just wanted to explain his side, as if there was any explanation that could make what he did okay. I tried reasoning with Glenn about leaving Sasha alone, but his eyes grew cold as he said she hadn't learned her lesson yet. Therefore, I realized the accident was just the beginning of his plan. The casual way he said it made me feel like I was talking to a stranger, not the brother I grew up with. The next morning, I called Sasha's sister to warn them, but Emma revealed they'd already filed a police report naming Glenn as a suspect. Therefore, the situation was moving beyond my control. They'd apparently found a threatening note in Sasha's mailbox that they believed came from Glenn. Officer Martinez arrived at our door to question Glenn, but Glenn had a practiced alibi about being at work during the tampering. Therefore, the officer left with only suspicions, not evidence. Glenn was so calm during the questioning, looking the officer right in the eyes as he lied. The confident way he handled it made me wonder how many times he'd lied to authority figures without me realizing it. Glenn seemed triumphant after the police left, but a voice message from the comedy club owner permanently banning him triggered his rage. Therefore, he punched a hole in the wall while screaming about ungrateful audiences. I'd never seen him lose control like that before. He'd always been calculated even in his worst moments. The message must have been the final confirmation that his comedy career was over, at least locally. I tried to convince our parents that Glenn needed psychiatric help, but they dismissed his behavior as going through a phase. Therefore, I felt increasingly alone in recognizing how dangerous he was becoming. Dad actually said, he's just processing rejection in his own way, as if sabotaging someone's car was just an unusual coping mechanism. News broke that Mrs. Keaton, the elderly accident victim, was pressing charges against Sasha, but Sasha's lawyer countered by suggesting vehicle tampering. Therefore, both women were now caught in Glenn's twisted game. The local news ran a small segment about it, emphasizing the mysterious circumstances of the accident. I managed to access Glenn's search history on our shared desktop, but what I found, searches for untraceable poisons and how to break into apartments, terrified me. Therefore, I immediately copied everything to a USB drive as evidence. There were dozens of searches about surveillance cameras, lockpicking, and even how long certain medications take to cause symptoms. Glenn discovered me with the USB drive, but instead of getting angry, he calmly said, "You don't understand what she deserves." Therefore, his controlled response frightened me more than any outburst could have. He wasn't even trying to deny what he was planning anymore, which made it clear he was past the point of caring about consequences. I decided to move out temporarily to stay with a friend, but Glenn helped me pack with unsettling politeness. Therefore, I couldn't sleep that night wondering what he might be planning. He kept saying things like, "I'll miss having you around," with this weird smile that didn't reach his eyes. The next day, local news reported someone had vandalized Sasha's car with the words "liar" spray painted across it, but security cameras caught only a hooded figure. Therefore, I knew it was Glenn, but couldn't prove it. The footage showed someone about Glenn's height and build, but nothing definitive enough for police to act on. Sasha received anonymous threatening texts, but when police traced them, they led to a prepaid phone purchased with cash. Therefore, Glenn maintained his thin veneer of deniability. The texts said things like, "You can't hide forever," and "Everyone will know what you did," vague enough to be threatening without being explicitly criminal. Mrs. Keaton's lawsuit against Sasha proceeded to preliminary hearings, but Sasha's legal team introduced the possibility of sabotage. Therefore, the judge ordered a forensic examination of the vehicle remains. The legal proceedings were draining Sasha financially, adding another layer to the nightmare Glenn had created for her. I visited Mrs. Keaton in rehab to explain my suspicions about Glenn, but the injured woman was initially skeptical, believing Sasha was at fault. Therefore, I had to show her Glenn's disturbing internet searches to make her understand the truth. She was understandably cautious. From her perspective, this was just the sibling of the other side, trying to deflect blame. Mrs. Keaton agreed to meet with Sasha to discuss what really happened, but Glenn somehow found out about their meeting. Therefore, I had to warn them both to change locations. I never figured out how he knew. Possibly he was monitoring my phone or had some contact at the rehab center. The forensic report on Sasha's car revealed clear evidence of tampering, but without fingerprints. It wasn't enough for an arrest. Therefore, the police began surveillance on Glenn, waiting for him to make a mistake. The report confirmed the brake line had been deliberately cut in a way that would cause it to fail after short-term use. Exactly the kind of calculated harm Glenn would devise. Glenn noticed the unmarked police car watching our house, but instead of being deterred, he seemed energized by the challenge. Therefore, I realized he was enjoying the cat-and-mouse game. He even waved at the officers once, bringing them coffee another time, playing mind games that clearly unsettled them. I managed to get Sasha's new phone number to check on her, but when I called, she was panicked because someone had broken into her apartment. Therefore, I drove immediately to meet her. Nothing appeared to be stolen, but the intrusion itself was clearly meant to frighten her. Sasha showed me the small items moved in her apartment and a note left on her pillow saying, "I see you," but the police found no fingerprints or forced entry. Therefore, they suggested she stay with family temporarily. The note was typed, not handwritten, but the message was unmistakably threatening, especially placed on her pillow where she sleeps. Mrs. Keaton and Sasha finally met at the hospital cafeteria, but their conversation was interrupted when Glenn walked in, by coincidence. Therefore, security had to escort him out as Sasha had a panic attack. He claimed he was there visiting a sick friend, though he couldn't name who when security questioned him. Mrs. Keaton witnessed Glenn's disturbing behavior firsthand, but her lawyer advised continuing the case against Sasha until official charges were filed against Glenn. Therefore, the two women remained legally opposed, despite their growing alliance. Mrs. Keaton actually reached out to hold Sasha's hand during her panic attack, a small gesture of humanity that seemed to transcend their legal situation. I installed security cameras at my friend's apartment where I was staying, but Glenn never approached the place. Therefore, I realized he was being strategic, not impulsive. He was smart enough to know I would be watching for him, which made his other actions even more concerning. Glenn's work fired him after connecting him to the comedy club incident, but instead of looking for new jobs, he spent days in his room making plans. Therefore, our parents finally began to worry about his mental state. They started finding his excuses less convincing when he couldn't explain where his money was coming from or why he was going out at odd hours. Dad confronted Glenn about his behavior, but Glenn's explanation was so convincing and rational, therefore Dad ended up apologizing to him instead. Glenn had always been able to manipulate our father this way, turning confrontations around until he seemed like the reasonable one. I discovered Glenn had created a fake social media profile pretending to be a friend of Steve, Sasha's deceased father, but as I was documenting it, the profile suddenly disappeared. Therefore, I realized Glenn was monitoring my investigation of him. The profile had been reaching out to Sasha's friends, asking invasive questions about her whereabouts and routines. The brake fluid-stained tools disappeared from Glenn's room, but I had already sent the photos to Officer Martinez. Therefore, the police now had enough for a search warrant. I was relieved to have gotten those photos when I did, as Glenn was clearly covering his tracks. Police arrived with a warrant to search our house and Glenn's car, but Glenn remained eerily calm throughout the process. Therefore, I suspected he had hidden or disposed of any incriminating evidence. He even offered the officers coffee, playing the role of the cooperative, innocent person being unfairly targeted. The search found nothing in the house but a police dog, alerted to the trunk of Glenn's car. Therefore, they discovered a bag containing gloves, wire cutters, and Sasha's stolen mail. The mail included medical bills and legal correspondence, exactly the kind of information Glenn could use to continue harassing her. Glenn was taken in for questioning, but as they led him away, he looked directly at me and whispered, "This isn't over." Therefore, I knew that even arrest wouldn't stop whatever he had set in motion. The cold certainty in his voice made me believe he had contingency plans already in place. Glenn was released after 48 hours of questioning, but the detective told me they needed more evidence to charge him. Therefore, I became determined to find whatever he was hiding. They had enough to consider him a person of interest, but not enough for formal charges that would stick. When Glenn returned home, our parents treated him like the victim, but I noticed him smirking at me when they weren't looking. Therefore, I decided to search his cloud storage accounts while he slept. Mom made his favorite dinner, talking about how the justice system is supposed to presume innocence, completely missing the irony. I found Glenn's password written in a book, but his cloud storage had been recently wiped clean. Therefore, I had to recover deleted files using a data recovery program. I stayed up until 3 a.m. working on it, terrified Glenn would wake up and catch me again. The recovered files included photos of Sasha's daily routine and screenshots of her medical records, but this discovery made me so sick, I accidentally knocked over a cup. Therefore, Glenn woke up and caught me at his computer. The photos showed he'd been following her for weeks, documenting when she left for work, where she went for lunch, even which friends' houses she visited. Glenn threatened to tell our parents I was invading his privacy, but I countered by showing him the screenshots I'd already sent to Officer Martinez. Therefore, our confrontation became a tense standoff. He tried to grab my phone, but I'd already backed everything up to a secure email account. Mrs. Keaton's lawyer requested Sasha's medical history to establish damages, but during the discovery process, they found Sasha's heart condition was pre-existing. Therefore, the lawyer advised Mrs. Keaton that her case against Sasha was weakening. This minor heart murmur had nothing to do with the accident, but had become a legal technicality both sides were fighting over. Sasha began physical therapy for her injuries, but Glenn somehow obtained her therapy schedule. Therefore, she had to constantly change appointment times for safety. She was already dealing with healing from a traumatic car accident, and now had to manage the additional stress of avoiding her stalker. I installed a keylogger on our home computer to track Glenn's activities, but he started using internet cafes instead. Therefore, I had to find another way to monitor his plans. He caught on faster than I expected, which confirmed how careful he was being about covering his tracks. Mrs. Keaton visited Sasha in physical therapy to talk privately, but seeing their growing alliance enraged Glenn when he found out. Therefore, he created a fake email account pretending to be Sasha and sent threatening messages to Mrs. Keaton. He saw a newspaper photo of them together, leaving leaving the therapy center and completely lost it, throwing things around his room and muttering to himself. Mrs. Keaton received the threatening email supposedly from Sasha, but she immediately suspected it wasn't genuine. Therefore, she contacted both Sasha and the police about this new development. At 76, Mrs. Keaton was surprisingly tech-savvy and noticed details in the writing style that didn't match Sasha's previous communications. The police traced the fake email to a public library computer, but the security camera had been cleverly blocked by a book bag. Therefore, they couldn't definitively prove Glenn sent it. The librarian remembered someone matching Glenn's description, but couldn't make a positive ID from the photos police showed her. Glenn started seeing a therapist to create the impression he was getting help, but he was actually using the appointments to establish an alibi. Therefore, I became increasingly worried about what he was planning. He made sure our parents knew about these appointments, talking about his breakthroughs and personal growth at dinner. Sasha's sister Emma installed security cameras at their apartment, but Glenn learned about them through a mutual acquaintance. Therefore, he began plotting ways to disable them. The mutual friend didn't realize the danger and mentioned the new security system while running into Glenn at a coffee shop. I found pages of disturbing writings in Glenn's room about justice and teaching lessons. But when I tried to show our parents, Glenn had already convinced them I was persecuting him. Therefore, they refused to look at the evidence. Dad actually suggested I might need therapy to deal with my obsession with proving Glenn's guilt. A mutual friend revealed Glenn had asked detailed questions about Sasha's new security measures, but this friend became worried afterward. Therefore, they finally came forward to warn us about Glenn's persistent obsession. Glenn had casually questioned them about whether the cameras had night vision, or if they stored footage locally or in the cloud, specific technical details that revealed his intentions. Mrs. Keaton met with her lawyer to discuss dropping the case against Sasha, but the lawyer warned this might impact her insurance settlement. Therefore, she decided to pursue a different strategy. Insurance complications had created a situation where both women were financially incentivized to remain legal adversaries, despite both believing Glenn was the real culprit. Mrs. Keaton publicly announced she now believed Sasha was also a victim, but Glenn saw the news report and threw the remote through our TV screen. Therefore, our parents finally witnessed his volatile behavior firsthand. Mom actually flinched away from him, the first time I'd ever seen her afraid of her little performer. Our parents suggested Glenn stay with our aunt in another city to clear his head, but Glenn refused, saying he couldn't leave his therapy sessions. Therefore, the tension in our home reached unbearable levels. Dad started locking their bedroom door at night, though he never admitted he was afraid of his own son. I installed a GPS tracker on Glenn's car while he slept, but he discovered it after just 2 days. Therefore, he left it attached, but started borrowing friends' cars instead. He mentioned finding it casually over breakfast, saying, "Interesting gadget I found under my car. Yours?" with a knowing smile. Sasha was cleared to return to work, but on her first day back, all her tires were slashed. Therefore, the police installed a temporary surveillance camera near her parking spot. Her physical therapy practice had been incredibly supportive, but this incident made her consider looking for work in another city entirely. The surveillance camera caught Glenn approaching Sasha's new car at 2 a.m., but he wore a hoodie and kept his face turned away. Therefore, the footage wasn't clear enough for an immediate arrest. You could see his distinctive walk and build, but his face was never visible to the camera. Officer Martinez brought Glenn in for questioning again, but Glenn had prepared an alibi claiming he was at an all-night diner. Therefore, they had to release him while verifying his story. He had receipts and seemed to have thought of everything, but the police weren't giving up. The diner's security footage revealed Glenn had paid a homeless man to wear his distinctive jacket and sit in his usual booth, but the man eventually admitted Glenn had paid him $50 to do so. Therefore, the police finally had evidence of Glenn constructing false alibis. This was the first real break in building a case against him, proof he was deliberately creating false alibis. Glenn realized the police were closing in, but instead of lying low, he became more reckless. Therefore, I worried he was planning something drastic as a final act. His behavior became increasingly erratic, staying up all night pacing and muttering to himself. I discovered Glenn had purchased chemicals that could potentially harm someone, but when I reported this to Officer Martinez, they needed a warrant to search his storage unit. Therefore, we had to wait while the paperwork was processed. The receipt I found showed purchases of chemicals that individually were harmless, but together could create something dangerous. Mrs. Keaton and Sasha held a joint press conference announcing their cooperation in pursuing charges against Glenn, but the media attention triggered something in Glenn. Therefore, he disappeared for 24 terrifying hours. Seeing the two women he'd tried to pit against each other now united against him seemed to be the breaking point. The police pinged Glenn's phone to a cabin our family used to visit, but when they arrived, they found only the phone, not Glenn. Therefore, a wider search was initiated. He'd left his phone deliberately to mislead police while he went elsewhere, another example of his calculated thinking. I remembered Glenn's childhood hiding spot in the woods behind our old elementary school, but when I arrived there with Officer Martinez, we found disturbing evidence that Glenn had been planning something at Sasha's upcoming doctor appointment. Therefore, we raced to warn her. There were printed maps of the medical center with Sasha's doctor's office circled, and notes about the building's security protocols. Sasha was already at the medical center when we arrived, but security couldn't locate her in the building. Therefore, we initiated a lockdown while searching frantically. The minutes felt like hours as we checked every room, closet, and stairwell. We found Sasha trapped in a supply closet, shaken but unharmed, saying Glenn had just been there, but he fled when he heard the lockdown announcement. Therefore, the police expanded their search to the surrounding area. She said he'd been wearing scrubs and a surgical mask as a disguise, which explained how he'd moved through the medical center without being stopped. Security cameras caught Glenn escaping through a service entrance, but his car was still in the parking lot. Therefore, we knew he couldn't have gone far. The footage showed him changing out of the scrubs as he ran, revealing how thoroughly he'd planned his disguise. I received a text from Glenn saying, "You chose her side," but I used the opportunity to keep him talking while police traced the signal. Therefore, we discovered he was hiding in an abandoned building nearby. I replied, asking what he wanted, trying to sound sympathetic while Officer Martinez watched the trace narrowing down his location. Police surrounded the building and called for Glenn to surrender, but he refused to come out, claiming he had nothing left to lose. Therefore, a hostage negotiator was brought in. The standoff drew a small crowd and local news vans, creating exactly the kind of spectacle Glenn had always craved. The negotiator tried reasoning with Glenn for hours, but Glenn would only speak to me. Therefore, I had to wear a wire and approach the building despite everyone's concerns. Officer Martinez strongly advised against it, but ultimately agreed when Glenn threatened to harm himself if anyone else approached. Inside, I found Glenn surrounded by newspaper clippings about the accident and Sasha, but seeing his unraveling mental state terrified me. Therefore, I had to carefully navigate his fragile emotional state. The walls were covered with a timeline of events, connecting Sasha's betrayal at the comedy club to everything that followed, as if she were the villain in this story. Glenn revealed he'd been planning to stage an accident for Sasha at the medical center, but his real goal was to force her to admit she ruined his life on camera. Therefore, I realized his obsession was still primarily about his damaged ego. He had a phone set up on a tripod, ready to record whatever confrontation he had planned. I reminded Glenn of who he was before all this happened, but he laughed hollowly, saying that person was gone. Therefore, I changed tactics and appealed to his self-interest instead. I talked about how he could still have a future if he surrendered peacefully, maybe even write about his experiences someday. I convinced Glenn that surrendering peacefully would help his case, but as he considered this, police mistook a movement for aggression and stormed in. Therefore, Glenn panicked and tried to escape through a window. Everything happened so fast. Officers shouting, Glenn lunging for the window, me stuck in the middle trying to de-escalate. Glenn fell and injured his leg during the escape attempt, but instead of fighting, he suddenly became calm. Therefore, the police were able to take him into custody without further incident. It was like once he was caught, a switch flipped, and he stopped struggling against the inevitable. At the station, Glenn finally confessed to tampering with Sasha's car, but claimed he only meant to scare her, not hurt her. Therefore, his attorney immediately tried to minimize his culpability. The confession was a breakthrough, but his attempt to downplay his intentions showed he still wasn't taking full responsibility. Mrs. Keaton officially dropped her lawsuit against Sasha, but then filed a civil suit against Glenn instead. Therefore, both women were now aligned against him. Their joint press conference announcing this decision received much more media attention than the original accident, finally shifting the narrative toward the truth. Our parents finally accepted the truth about Glenn's actions, but they struggled with how to support him while acknowledging his crimes. Therefore, family therapy was suggested as part of the legal process. Mom broke down completely when shown the full evidence of what Glenn had done, while Dad became withdrawn and questioned where they had gone wrong. Glenn's defense team pushed for a mental health evaluation, but the prosecution had evidence of his meticulous planning. Therefore, the insanity defense strategy was unlikely to succeed. The evaluation might help with sentencing, but wouldn't exonerate him, given the calculated nature of his crimes. Sasha agreed to testify about the impact of Glenn's actions on her life, but recounting the trauma proved extremely difficult for her. Therefore, Mrs. Keaton sat with her for support during preparation sessions. Their unlikely friendship became a small positive outcome in this otherwise terrible situation. The district attorney offered Glenn a plea deal to avoid trial, but Glenn initially refused, still believing he was the victim. Therefore, the case proceeded toward a full trial. His attorney strongly advised accepting the deal, but Glenn insisted he could convince a jury of his perspective. Glenn's preliminary hearing revealed the full extent of his stalking behavior, but his attorney argued passionate emotions weren't the same as criminal intent. Therefore, the judge ordered a comprehensive psychological evaluation. The prosecution presented the evidence chronologically, showing how his behavior escalated from the comedy club incident to the brake tampering and beyond. The psychologist diagnosed Glenn with narcissistic personality disorder, but noted he was fully aware of right and wrong. Therefore, the evaluation supported the prosecution's case rather than helping Glenn. The diagnosis explained some of his behavior patterns, but confirmed he understood the consequences of his actions and chose to proceed anyway. I was called to testify about Glenn's behavior before and after the accident, but facing my brother in court was emotionally devastating. Therefore, I broke down during cross-examination, having to publicly detail the warning signs I'd seen throughout our childhood while he stared at me from the defendant's table was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Glenn watched my testimony without emotion, but when Mrs. Keaton described how the accident incident had changed her life, his facade finally cracked. Therefore, the jury saw his true reaction when confronted with the consequences of his actions. For the first time, he seemed to realize the real human impact of what he'd done, beyond his personal vendetta against Sasha. Our parents attended every day of the trial, but the evidence of Glenn's calculated behavior destroyed their remaining denials. Therefore, they finally acknowledged they'd missed warning signs for years. Mom actually apologized to me during a court recess for dismissing my concerns about Glenn when we were younger. Sasha's testimony detailed not just the accident, but Glenn's ongoing harassment, but reliving these events triggered her anxiety. Therefore, she required several breaks to complete her testimony. Her strength throughout the process was remarkable, especially considering she was still recovering physically from the accident. Glenn's former comedy colleagues testified about his inappropriate material and boundary issues, but one friend also described Glenn's talent and potential before his decline. Therefore, the jury saw the complex picture of a talented person who'd made terrible choices. Several comedians described instances where Glenn had stolen material or sabotaged others' performances when he felt threatened. During the trial's second week, Glenn finally agreed to consider a plea deal, but he insisted on reading a statement in court first. Therefore, everyone braced for either an apology or more accusations. The prosecution was cautiously optimistic, but prepared for Glenn to potentially make things worse for himself. Glenn's statement started with blame and justifications, but as he continued speaking, something shifted in his demeanor. Therefore, the court watched in surprise as he finally acknowledged the pain he'd caused. Whether this change was genuine or performance is something I still wonder about today. Glenn admitted tampering with Sasha's car and all subsequent harassment, but claimed he never intended to cause serious harm. Therefore, the prosecution agreed to reduce certain charges in exchange for a guilty plea. The distinction between intent to harm and intent to kill became a key factor in the negotiations. The plea agreement included significant prison time for assault and stalking, but also mandated psychiatric treatment. Therefore, Glenn would receive the help he needed while facing consequences. 5 years with possibility of parole after 3, plus 5 years of supervised release with mandatory therapy and no contact orders. Sasha requested a permanent restraining order, but also asked that the court mandate therapy for Glenn, therefore showing compassion even after everything he'd done. Her statement about wanting him to get help, rather than purely seeking punishment, moved many people in the courtroom. Mrs. Keaton attended the sentencing hearing with her family, but rather than expressing anger, she spoke about second chances and healing, therefore surprising everyone with her grace. At 76, she talked about not wanting to waste whatever time she had left on hatred, a perspective that visibly affected even the judge. The judge delivered a stern lecture about the seriousness of Glenn's actions, but acknowledged his late acceptance of responsibility, therefore setting a sentence that balanced punishment with rehabilitation. He emphasized that Glenn's talent could have taken him in positive directions if he'd channeled it constructively. As Glenn was led away, he looked back at me with genuine remorse for the first time, but his actions had permanently changed too many lives, therefore true forgiveness would be a long and uncertain journey. That momentary connection we shared across the courtroom felt both significant and utterly insufficient given everything that had happened. 6 months into Glenn's 5-year sentence, I finally agreed to visit him in prison, but seeing him in his uniform was harder than I expected. Therefore, our conversation was awkward and stilted. We talked about superficial things, the food, his cellmate, books he was reading, avoiding the deeper issues that still stood between us. Glenn had started journaling as part of his therapy, but reading his early entries showed he still struggled with taking full responsibility. Therefore, his counselor focused on building his empathy through various exercises. He shared some of these journal pages with me, and while there were glimpses of genuine insight, he still framed much of the story with himself at the center. Sasha began volunteering with a victims advocacy group, but occasionally she still had nightmares about the accident. Therefore, her healing process remained ongoing despite her brave public face. She specifically worked with victims of stalking, using her experience to help others recognize warning signs earlier than she had. Mrs. Keaton completed her physical rehabilitation, but her doctors confirmed she would always walk with a slight limp. Therefore, she focused on adapting her beloved gardening hobby to accommodate her new limitations. She created a raised garden bed system that allowed her to continue gardening without having to kneel or bend as much. I helped Mrs. Keaton with her garden redesign, but she surprised me by asking about Glenn's progress. Therefore, we began a cautious friendship, bonded by our complicated connection to the incident. Her capacity for forgiveness continually amazed me, especially considering she'd been an innocent bystander in Glenn's revenge scheme. Our parents joined a support group for families of incarcerated individuals, but they struggled with feelings of guilt and responsibility. Therefore, I suggested they focus on supporting Glenn's recovery rather than dwelling on the past. Mom threw herself into researching personality disorders, while Dad retreated into work, their different coping mechanisms creating new tension between them. Glenn's prison therapist reported he was making genuine progress, but warned that narcissistic patterns were deeply ingrained, therefore recovery would be a lifelong process, not a quick fix. Each small step toward genuine empathy was celebrated, but always always with the caution that sustained effort would be required. On the 1-year anniversary of the accident, Mrs. Keaton invited Sasha to her home, but what started as a solemn remembrance evolved into sharing stories and even occasional laughter, therefore beginning a healing friendship neither had anticipated. They discovered they both loved gardening and classic movies, connections that helped transform a relationship that began with trauma into something positive. Glenn requested permission to write apology letters to both women, but his therapist suggested waiting until his progress was more established. Therefore, he focused instead on understanding the impact of his actions through role-playing exercises. The prison counselor believed premature apologies might do more harm than good if Glenn wasn't truly ready to take full responsibility. I found Glenn's old comedy notebooks while cleaning out his room, but instead of the mean-spirited material he'd become known for, his earliest work showed genuine wit and warmth. Therefore, I brought copies on my next visit to remind him of who he could still become. These notebooks from his college days contained observational humor that didn't rely on cruelty or shock value, proof that he could be funny without hurting others. During my visit, Glenn shared insights from his therapy about his desperate need for attention and control, but acknowledged for the first time that he'd hurt people who cared about him, therefore showing the first genuine signs of growth and self-awareness. He talked about patterns going back to childhood, connecting his attention-seeking stunts to his later destructive behaviors in a way that showed real reflection. Sasha decided to meet with a prison counselor to discuss possibly reading Glenn's future apology letter, but stipulated she wasn't ready for direct contact. Therefore, the counselor began preparing both parties for a potential restorative justice session. This careful approach prioritized Sasha's healing, while leaving open the possibility of closure for everyone involved. After 18 months, Glenn had earned privileges through good behavior, but refused special treatment, saying he deserved his full sentence, therefore surprising the guards who had initially pegged him as a troublemaker. This rejection of advantages showed a level of accountability that his counselor noted as significant progress in his therapy. Mrs. Keaton attended Glenn's parole hearing to everyone's surprise, but instead of opposing early release, she spoke about her belief in rehabilitation, therefore demonstrating extraordinary compassion that moved everyone in the room. She explained that while she would never forget what happened, her remaining years were too precious to spend on resentment. The parole board acknowledged Glenn's progress and the victim's input, but maintained that actions must have consequences. Therefore, Glenn would serve his full sentence, but with the knowledge that a second chance at life awaited him afterward. The board committed to reviewing his case again in 18 months, noting his participation in therapy and work programs as positive factors. I never expected to find forgiveness in my heart for what Glenn did, but seeing his genuine efforts to change gave me hope. The hardest part was knowing how much pain could have been avoided if someone had recognized Glenn's issues sooner. Mrs. Keaton once told me she believed people could change if they truly wanted to, and I've held on to that. Glenn will be eligible for supervised release in another year, and Sasha has finally agreed to read his apology letter, though she still doesn't want direct contact. As for me, I'm studying psychology now, hoping to help others recognize dangerous patterns before they escalate. If there's one thing I've learned from this nightmare, it's that the line between a troubled person and a dangerous one is thinner than most people realize. Pay attention to the warning signs in the people you love. I wish I had.